Welcome to this very special edition of Gravitas, coming to you live and exclusive from Wuhan. We take you where the story is, and today the story is developing in this city in central China. Friday is movie day in India, and today's superstars from today's blockbuster were Prime Minister Modi of India and President Xi Jinping of China. They met on more than 3 occasions today for more than 3 hours and discussed everything from bilateral relations to the direction that the world is taking at large. It's a very, very important meeting. It's being called a game-changing visit, a reset in India-China ties, the coming together of 2 Asian giants. A lot has been said. We'll discuss all of that. We'll bring you the story, the color, the symbolism and the significance ahead on Gravitas. And then we'll take you to the Korean Peninsula, which also witnessed historic talks. For the first time in 70 years, the leaders of the 2 Koreas, North and South, coming together to talk about peace in their respective countries. All of that coming up on this very, very special show. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. Tonight's cover story on Gravitas comes from the heart of the action in Wuhan, where the Prime Minister of India and the President of China held perhaps the most wide-ranging talks ever. They spent considerable time together, most of it minus diplomats. And Beyond was here to bring you all the action firsthand. Take a look at our top story.
This is a meeting that could shape the future of India-China ties. Asia watchers remain glued to the informal dialogue between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. On Friday, both leaders began their conversation. The Chinese President gave a warm welcome to the Indian Prime Minister at the Hubei Provincial Museum in Wuhan.
भारत की और चीन की दोनों की विशेषता थी कि हमारी सारी संस्कृति नदियों के किनारे पर। भारत के भी 5000 साल पहले मोहनजोदड़ो, हड़प्पन, इस कल्चर की अगर हम चर्चा करें तो सारा विकास नदी के तट पर होता था।
The 2 leaders spent considerable time together. They held talks at the State Guest House in the city. The Chinese President also hosted a dinner for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There was no protocol or agenda for the talks.
मैं बहुत प्रभावित हुआ था जिस प्रकार से वाटरवे के लिए काम किया, बिजली का काम किया और बहुत अच्छा टूरिस्ट सेंटर भी डेवलप हो गया।
While the event may have been billed as an informal conversation between both leaders, this is perhaps the most wide-ranging dialogue between India and China in the recent history. It's an attempt by both sides to iron out their differences after the Doklam standoff in 2017. There was considerable buzz around Wuhan, the city which is hosting Prime Minister Modi. Despite tight security, crowds gathered around Hotel Wanda, where the Indian Prime Minister is staying. Some people even welcomed Prime Minister Modi with songs of an Indian movie called Secret Superstar, a film that's been well received in China. While there's no agenda for these talks, this 2-day dialogue between the leaders will lay the foundation for the future of India-China relationship. The talks have raised hopes beyond India and China. At a time when winds of change are blowing from the west, a reset between India and China is an exciting prospect for Asia and the world. With Palki Sharma Upadhyay in Wuhan, Bureau Report, Beyond.
Joining us this evening on Gravitas is a very special guest, Ms. Nirupama Rao, who's not only been India's Foreign Secretary but also has served as India's ambassador to China, someone who understands how South Bloc works and also knows what works and what doesn't work in China. Ms. Rao, thanks very much for joining us. My first question to you, how do you see Modi's take on the new Panchsheel?
Well, I think the Panchsheel, as it was originally conceived by India and China, came not only to define the relationship, but it also expressed in many ways the aspirations of a new Asia. So to revive that approach, calling it a new Panchsheel or whatever the leaders may like to name it by, well, I think that is a positive expression of intent. Of course, we have to see how this translates into action. So we have the lights, we have camera, but now we need action.
The Prime Minister of India has called for more such informal interactions. He's invited President Xi Jinping for another round of informal talks in India next year. How do you see this move?
Yes, definitely. I am convinced, and I think anybody you speak to who's had experience of the relationship would affirm basically that we need leadership level contacts at a much more frequent and sustained, systematic and regular level. So if Prime Minister Modi has invited President Xi to visit India, I think that's a good move. It's a smart move. And I think we must ensure that this happens and the leaders develop that level of communication and trust and confidence in each other. Because that's the only way I believe they can focus on the outstanding issues between the two countries. You can't leave it to the officials to solve, you know.
This meeting has been hailed by most as a game changer, but there have been its fair share of critics as well. There's an impression that it was born out of China's compulsions, out of the fact that China is facing pressure from various quarters, including the US, on the trade war.
Well, I've heard it said, and I would agree with that observation, that, you cannot say that despite the fact that you call China a new superpower, you cannot say that its strategic position is all that strong. I think it faces a number of challenges in Asia, not only by virtue of its geographical position, but in terms of the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the region. So China's position is not as secure and unassailable as we would assume it to be. Secondly, I think when it comes to India, I remember that quotation from our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who said that never forget that the basic challenge that runs across the spine of Asia is the challenge of the relationship between India and China. And India, as China's largest neighbor, as equally an Asian giant, we share a border of close to 3,500 kilometers between the two countries. There are unsolved, outstanding issues. There's a legacy of history, of troubled relations. Obviously, we have to engage with each other. It's not about China coming down from wherever it is, We have to meet, the Himalayas, may have, as somebody said, ceased to exist when the Chinese entered Tibet. But the fact is we have a Himalayan border, an unresolved border between our two countries. We have questions of trade. We have questions of imbalances. We have a question of the Chinese profile in the Indian Ocean, its military heft, the strength that is being expressed by China in our neighborhood, the bases that it is acquiring. There's so much that we need to address in this relationship. And I think when Prime Minister Modi spoke about the long-term perspective that we need to bring to this relationship, I think he's spot on where that is concerned. This is going to be a long haul. It's like running a marathon.
We're tracking reactions here in Wuhan in China and also in New Delhi. You're in Singapore right now. How is this meeting of the leaders of two biggest Asian giants being seen in Southeast Asia?
I think the Southeast Asian nations, and Singapore is a leading one, I believe they want good relations between India and China. They want to see dialogue. They want to see resolution of outstanding problems. And both India and China are engaging, as you know, very closely with the ASEAN group. We had all the 10 ASEAN leaders come to Delhi for our Republic Day. I think that was a great sleight of hand as far as our foreign policy establishment was concerned. And our Act East policy, you know, symbolizes and in many ways expresses that urge for India to engage more closely with the ASEAN countries. So much connects us with them. And I believe they want good relations between India and China. They want to see a reduction of tension. They want to see the tackling of the trust deficit.
And while both sides are at pains to tell us that there may be no breakthrough, what would you want as a result of this informal summit?
Well, I think the emphasis has to be on long term. I'm not, you know, looking at the short-term takeaways or gains from this summit. It's an extremely positive development that the two leaders are meeting. I believe it's almost a year to the day, you know, when this Doklam crisis broke upon us. And we all know the experience from that standoff that happened in Bhutan last year. We certainly don't want a repetition of that. And if the two leaders can agree that the two sides will ensure good communication and contact in order to prevent, you know, these differences, as our ambassador in China noted recently, to prevent these differences from turning into disputes. I think that will be a signal achievement. I think we will have to see how they address other outstanding issues. You know, the media speaks about the listing of Masood Azhar. They speak about the membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group for India and the Chinese stand on that. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, about which we have such strong reservations. All these differences, I would not call them disputes, all these differences between the two countries are not likely to go away just because of a meeting in Wuhan. But the very fact that the two leaders have the confidence in each other to continue this process of dialogue and to meet again in the near future, in many ways, I think, is a very good augury for the relationship, and we must sustain it. We've had summits of this kind before. I'm thinking of the first summit between India and China in 1954 when Prime Minister Nehru went to Beijing and was greeted by millions of people. And then you had Premier Zhou Enlai come to Delhi a number of times. And then we had the historic visit of Rajiv Gandhi to China in 1988. And then we had Prime Minister Vajpayee and, of course, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao before him. We've had a succession of leadership level contact between India and China, but never at a sustained level. And that is why I think we need a continuum to be established in terms of communication between our two leaders. They should be able to pick up the phone and speak to each other. You know, that hotline must operate so that if there is a crisis or an impending problem or difficulty, you know, it can be resolved without it escalating into the kind of crisis that you saw last year. So I think contact, communication, confidence, I think that is really of very great importance to the relationship.
Ms. Rao, thanks very much for joining us here on Gravitas. Appreciate your perspective. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's diplomatic masterstroke began in 2014 when he invited the heads of SAARC states for his swearing-in ceremony. And since then, much has been said about his hug diplomacy, about his out-of-the-box thinking. Has his unorthodox style often resulted in situations way beyond the control of India's diplomats and the military? Our next report answers that.
मैं नरेंद्र दामोदर दास मोदी ईश्वर की शपथ लेता हूं कि
On May 26, 2014, Narendra Modi took oath as the Prime Minister of India. And in attendance were heads of state of all SAARC nations. That image set the stage for a new sort of diplomacy. One that has left its mark on Modi's external dealings in the last 4 years. An unprecedented churn in South Asia called for imaginative solutions. And Modi's out-of-the-box foreign policy seemed to tackle just that. Narendra Modi's diplomacy has often been touted as a cavalier one. but his personal touch has aimed to strengthen India's interests at large. Modi's Wuhan visit does just that. An informal setting allows for a free exchange of views, one that is free from protocols. Like his visit to the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington along with the then Prime Minister Barack Obama. Or his boat trip in Paris with the then French President François Hollande. But has Modi's unconventional approach to diplomacy worked? If you look at the bigger picture, it seems like it has. Narendra Modi's friendship with the Japanese Prime Minister dates back to his days as the Chief Minister in Gujarat. When Modi became the Prime Minister, this relationship with Shinzo Abe paid dividends. It helped secure concessional financing for his dream project, the bullet train, and the civilian nuclear deal. The Indian Prime Minister has also increasingly worked the phones to strengthen ties with key world leaders, including Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. He has not hesitated to call his counterparts in seeking support for India's interests at multilateral fora. The outreach has helped India gain membership of export control regimes like the MTCR, the Wassenaar Agreement and the Australia Group. It also yielded positive results during the fiercely contested ICJ elections. What about closer home? Narendra Modi's visit to Lahore to meet former Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was sharply criticised. But that did not stop India from standing up to Pakistan and suspending bilateral talks when it was needed. Take China's example. At the height of the Doklam standoff in July 2017, Narendra Modi reached out to Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The two shook hands and mutually agreed to defuse the crisis diplomatically. Modi's outreach de-escalated the standoff by August 28, 2017. In the last 4 years, Narendra Modi's style of diplomacy has not only got the country more friends, but even cemented India's relationship with countries that weren't even on the diplomatic radar until a few years ago. An assessment of his foreign policy makes one thing clear. Narendra Modi is rewriting the delicate art of diplomacy, one hug at a time. Bureau Report, WION.
He's seen as China's most powerful leader in decades, perhaps as powerful as Mao Zedong himself. His presidency has no term limits. He has full control both over the party and the government. Here's a look at why Xi Jinping is the best placed to chart a new course for the India-China relationship.
China's President Xi Jinping has many faces. To his people, he is the strong man who has cracked down on corruption in high places. To his party, his vision is driving an ambitious economic and strategic program. But for the world, Xi Jinping is the man who has anointed himself emperor for life. There is no doubt that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese president in decades. Born a princeling, meaning he's the son of a communist leader who rose to prominence alongside Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping is seen as rekindling policies harkening back to earlier times. Xi has kept a tight grip on power. He is the commander of the armed forces, a new position that grants him the authority to appoint military chiefs. He also heads the Group for Internet Security, the Group for Finance and Economic Affairs, head of the Group for Deepening Reforms. His ruthless campaign against graft has seen the departure of powerful political, military and regional leaders. It is a campaign that seems to have brought popular support. Under Xi, China is also seeking to bring in wide-ranging domestic economic reforms that will boost growth. The Belt and Road Initiative could cement China's pole position in rearranging world trade, but there are challenges and obstacles. Bureau Report, WION.
Much has been said about the venue. Why has Wuhan been chosen as the site of this informal meeting? Why not Beijing? The first impression, the first thought that strikes you when you land here is that this is unlike any other Tier 2 city in India. So we decided to give you a tour of the place that is going to go down in history as the venue of the India-China reset. Take a look. In the 1930s, Wuhan was the capital of China. It was described as a cosmopolitan metropolis. It has seen wars, it has been razed to the ground, and it has risen phoenix-like almost. And look at this bustling town today. It's a Tier 2 city technically, but if you look at the skyscrapers, if you look at the skyline, the city center, the roads, the infrastructure, and if you compare it to an average Indian town, you will see the difference. You will see how far China has come in this race. So we're going to take you on a tour to Wuhan to see what the Indian delegation can take back as it as it looks at some things that it can learn from the Chinese. Come with me. Ties between two countries strengthen only when their people come together, and that's a point that all leaders involved have stressed, right from Sushma Swaraj, the Foreign Affairs Minister who was in Beijing only last week. She said that it's important to overcome the language barrier. It's important to look at people-to-people contact, and one of the factors that binds India and China perhaps is yoga. We visited a yoga center here in Wuhan. There are 6 of them, we can tell you, to bring you this report. We're not just talking about the meeting of leaders, we're talking about soft diplomacy, and the only thing that is popular after Bollywood from India is yoga, and yoga is very popular in China as well. And so we are using the yoga analogy, stories from yoga, to try to explain to you how this relationship has evolved. Around this time last year, when there was a border standoff, some could say that this was like the Veer Bhadrasan, the warrior pose. That is the pose that both countries had struck, and they were at each other, and this is the warrior pose as they're learning. Now, then it came to the Setu Bandhasan. They tried to build bridges. They tried to come together and connect. And this is the Setu Bandhasan that they're both trying to do. And now that those bridges have been built, let's just say that both the leaders are sitting down, and this is what I can do best. I can't do all of that stretching. So this is called Sukhasan. They're sitting down comfortably across each other and talking, and this perhaps symbolizes where the India-China relationship right now stands. We've told you what happened in Wuhan, but there was another very important meeting that took place today, another historic meeting, and this was on the Korean Peninsula in the demilitarized zone. That is where the president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, held talks with the president of North Korea, the supreme leader as he calls himself, Kim Jong-un. It's the first time in 7 decades that the countries which have been loggerheads have come together. There was only an armistice in place since 1953 after the war, and today the two leaders have declared no more war in Korea. WION was there on the South Korean side of the demilitarized zone to bring you all the day's top developments.
Sharp at 9:30 Korean time, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un reached the Peace House in Panmunjom village for his historic summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Every act in this meeting was meticulously choreographed. The two leaders shook hands on the line dividing the two Koreas and exchanged pleasantries. As Kim Jong-un stepped over the line, called the 38th parallel, he became the first North Korean leader to set foot in South Korean soil. His wife, Ri Sol-ju, arrived separately. At the Peace House, reflecting the mood of the summit, Kim signed in the guest book with this message: "A new history begins now, the age of peace, at the starting point of history." The two Korean leaders also planted a pine tree from the year 1953, when the armistice ending the Korean War was signed. The two leaders threw soil sourced from north and south and watered the plant. In the defining image of the day, the two leaders walked over a blue-painted bridge in the demilitarized zone and, seated on a bench, had a one-on-one conversation lasting almost 30 minutes. Later, addressing the media, Kim Jong-un made some general remarks, promising not to repeat past mistakes.
I have crossed such a borderline, and I come here.
북한남 언결의 소망과 기대를 무겁게 받아들이고 북남 인민들이 절실히 바라는 문제 해결을 위해 많은 의제들을 진지하게
We hope that the peninsula could hear more signs of peace. And on top of that, we're going to take a lot of effective measures so that peace and prosperity will settle down here in the Korea Peninsula, and we will have a new chapter of development. From now on, the peninsula will not see war again. We will move towards the pathway of peace. In the past years, because of separation, our peninsula has undergone a lot of suffering, but we are convinced that we can move past such an obstacle. That's why we're standing here.
A joint Panmunjom declaration will now form the blueprint for peace talks between the two nations. It seeks to address several sticking points in the bilateral relations between the two Koreas. Complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, trilateral meetings with the US and China to resolve conflicts, disarmament by both nations in a phased manner, strict adherence to the non-aggression agreement, more exchanges, visits, and cooperation at all levels. Denuclearization still remains the sticking point, although the Panmunjom Declaration speaks of phased disarmament and denuclearization. Kim Jong-un himself, during his media address, skirted the issue. Bureau Report, WION.
So what did the two leaders who were so far seen as bitter enemies of each other, achieve in today's talks? WION's Ramesh Ramachandran sums it up from Seoul.
He came, he saw, he concurred with Moon Jae-in that now there is no turning back and that it is in the interest of the two Koreas that they have permanent peace on the Korean peninsula. But the big takeaway from the third Inter-Korean summit, which concluded in Panmunjom village inside the demilitarized zone that separates North Korea from South Korea, is that Moon Jae-in told in his joint press statement along with Kim Jong-un that North Korea has agreed that complete denuclearization will be achieved and that it remains their common goal. Now, on balance, Kim Jong-un has shared a new facet of his personality, one that is more amenable to reason, more reasonable, more accommodating, and that this might work to his advantage going forward in changing the world's perception of him as a madman or unpredictable politician. On balance, the challenges going forward remain to resolve the other contentious issues of unification of inter-Korean relations. But Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un have declared in their joint press statements that they will maintain regular contacts going forward and that Moon Jae-in will be traveling to Pyongyang later this year for a reciprocal visit to North Korea. Also, that they will stop all propaganda broadcasts that are beamed into their respective territories across the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, from the 1st of May, and that this will set the stage. This is a good omen, so to speak, for the much anticipated meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Remember, Donald Trump has always said that he wants North Korea to expressly commit itself to complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization, and that, to my mind, has been indicated in so many words in Moon Jae-in's joint press statement, but he said that complete denuclearization shall be their common objective. All in all, a fruitful, successful inter-Korean summit, one which bodes well for the two Koreas and their respective peoples. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran in Seoul for WION.
Today's landmark meeting between the leaders of North and South Korea saw mixed reactions. Some in South Korea said that this was not the best idea. Others said that this is the best course to strike peace. And these reactions were reflected internationally, in fact, as pictures and news flashes of the meeting beamed across screens and social media. These are the reactions we got.
As the North and South Korean leaders met in their first summit for the two Koreas in over a decade, some 300 South Korean protesters gathered near the inter-Korean border today. They do not like the North Korean regime. They do not trust the influence the North could have on the South.
I came here because I was upset and annoyed at the inter-Korean summit. The Republic of South Korea is collapsing. It's becoming communist. We're gathered here to say we're against the South and North Korean summit.
But another 100 or so people were also there to demonstrate their support for the historic meet.
I suddenly burst into tears when the North Korean leader crossed into the south, met President Moon Jae-in and crossed the military demarcation line. I don't know why exactly I was crying, but I was touched because of that moment.
South Korean politicians who've been actively trying to bridge North-South relations for decades have high hopes for what these talks will result in.
This summit of the heads of state is meaningful to steer the North-South relations back on the right track. Over the past 25 years, we can say that the Korean Peninsula has failed to get out of the shadow cast by the Cold War due to the existence of the nuclear crisis. So I think this summit is a decisive opportunity for the two Koreas to end this plight.
The first foreign leader to react to the meeting has been the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. He expressed caution as the two Korean heads of state met.
We welcome, but with caution, these meetings and the remarks that have been made by Kim Jong-un. But we have seen this before. We have had false dawns before on the Korean Peninsula. So that's why it's really important to maintain the pressure of the sanctions. It's the economic sanctions that have brought this apparent change in attitude, and that pressure has to be maintained. But the goal is denuclearisation of the Korean Peninsula.
Turnbull only expressed what other world leaders such as US President Donald Trump have been saying in the weeks ahead of the historic talks. The world is willing to be cautious on this meeting of the two Koreas, but it's also more than willing to have a little, if not a lot of hope that peace can be achieved in the two nations that have been technically at war for 60 years. Arabella Sibalak, WION.
Kim Jong-un's handshake with Moon Jae-in is the stuff of history, regardless of the outcome. Here's a look at some other handshakes that went down in history as very significant ones.
On the 13th of September 1993, after months of secret negotiations in Norway, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat witnessed the signing of the Oslo Accords on the lawns of the White House. And in one of the most dramatic moments, with President Bill Clinton looking on, arms around both leaders, Arafat and Rabin shook hands, symbolizing a rare moment of hope in the bitter Arab-Israeli conflict. In June 2012, in a landmark moment in the Northern Ireland peace process, Britain's Queen Elizabeth II shook hands with Martin McGuinness, a former top commander of the Irish Republican Army, which had waged a bloody 4-decade-long struggle against British rule. In December 2013, at a memorial service in South Africa for the late Nelson Mandela, US President Barack Obama made headlines when he shook hands with Cuba's Raul Castro. This was the first such public greeting between leaders of two bitter neighbors. After decades of estrangement following a traumatic split at the end of China's civil war in 1949, the presidents of China and Taiwan met for the first time ever in Singapore in 2015. China's Xi Jinping and Taiwan's Ma Ying-jeou shook hands for more than a minute and even smiled before holding talks. The next major handshake on the global calendar is expected to feature Kim Jong-un again, but this time with US President Donald Trump. While it will certainly mark a historic moment, handshakes involving Trump sometimes make headlines for the wrong reason. The US president is well known for his awkward grapples. Most famously, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe last year appeared to roll his eyes in an apparent expression of relief after a long handshake with Trump in Washington, D.C. So how will Kim Jong-un react to Trump's iron grip-like handshake? We are waiting to see. Bureau Report, WION.